It is 8:08, and with me on the phone from Massachusetts is Joe Comerford, the Executive Director of the National Priorities Project. It is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization with the mission to make the federal budget accessible and transparent. And she said Congress must recommit to an appropriations process that is regular and transparent so that citizens can influence in a meaningful way how their tax dollars are spent and ensure the government stays open to spend them. I'm glad to have Joe Comerford on this morning. Joe, good morning.
Oh, good morning. I'm so delighted to be with you.
Joe, first off, for folks who may be new to hearing about the National Priorities Project, can you tell them about it? I'm really glad we could talk this morning. So can you tell them?
Thank you so much. Sure. National Priorities Project is a federal budget research organization, and we think of ourselves as the people's guide to the federal budget, meaning that we work for you and your listeners, cracking open the federal budget both in terms of how the government plans to make the money and how it plans to spend the money. And we work for a greater accountability and a greater representation of the broadest possible public's wishes inside the federal budget. Our URL is National Priorities, IES, nationalpriorities.org. And we also, you can follow us on Twitter at NatPriorities, and we have a Facebook account, we have Pinterest, you name it, YouTube. So there are lots of ways to access our content.
Now, the National Priorities Project has called the government shutdown a failure of democracy. So talk about what you mean by that. This need and this pattern, right? This pattern of these stopgap budget continuing resolutions, right? Talk about the problem.
Sure. Well, what happened on October 1st or at midnight on September 30th was an extension of a fairly dysfunctional Congress at this moment. So in the last 10 years, we have not had a budget. This nation has not had a fully considered budget on October 1. And so this government shutdown is an extension of that problem and really heightened by a Congress that is highly politicized, highly locked down. And so the kind of crisis that we're in now is actually a people-made crisis. It's much like the debt ceiling conversation in our view. It's much like the conversation about taxes or the fiscal cliff. Congress needs actually to have a nuanced and considered conversation, and in the absence of doing that has driven us to these points of crisis that actually the thing that worries us most is that ordinary folks can't weigh in and talk to congresspeople and senators with their priorities because the process right now is so fraught and there's so much misinformation being slung around that it's hard to make sense of it, and therefore it's hard to engage, and that's what we need most is people at the center of this budgeting process.
And so you've said that Congress must recommit to an appropriations process that is regular and transparent so that citizens can influence this in a meaningful way. For 10 years, actually I think it's 12 appropriation bills you say that were not passed on time?
Sure. We actually only had 1 year in the last decade where Congress actually has considered 12 full appropriations. So how it's supposed to work on the books is that the president delivers a budget to the nation, and we remember this in February, right? The president puts the next fiscal year budget before the nation, before Congress, and says, okay, this is our best thinking. This represents everybody in the agency level saying this is what we need to do the best job for the people of the United States. And then Congress is supposed to do one thing first, which is think about the size of the budget, the amount of the budget, and how the president proposes to make the money,
so
taxes. And then it's supposed to decide on the programs that money would fund. So how many Head Start slots, how many Title I teachers, how many dollars to renewable energy research and development. It's supposed to have considered allocation processes or appropriations processes that are informed, that the public weighs in on before coming to a decision. And we haven't been able to do that here.
And so for the last decade, you call it a last-minute opaque appropriations by continuing resolution. So what kind of choices then? What kind of decisions are made? And there's just no time to weigh in. I know that in one of the comments I read by you that it really is this military funding at the expense of looking at social services programs for the people. So these last minute opaque continuing resolutions that appropriate money.
Sure. Yeah, the continuing resolutions that the government has relied on heavily in the last decade, they're not terrible things. Sometimes, everybody can need a few more days to get their act together, right? So they're not terrible. But Congress has relied so heavily on them that so as to make the process really hard, really opaque, as you say, so that I don't know what's happening, and so if I care about housing or if I care about education or the environment or transportation or accessibility issues, it's very hard for me right now to weigh in with my elected officials and make my voice heard about my priorities. And so these continuing resolutions are basically do-overs of the prior year. So they just continue funding levels and spending priorities from the year prior. So Congress doesn't really consider the new things that are on the table, the new ideas.
And it sort of further embeds something like the sequestration cuts then, right? I mean, that sort of then becomes more long-standing. Is that what's going to happen now because of this?
Sure, yeah. We don't know exactly what's going to happen with regard to sequestration. And I'm glad you raised sequestration because I'd love to talk about August 2011. But, right, we don't get to have a fully considered discussion. So, for example, the House passed a budget. It passed a continuing resolution that actually cut more from domestic programs and increased military spending this time around and sent it to the Senate. It also stripped out Obamacare, which was really the main point of friction between the House and the Senate, and that's what started this whole last-minute crisis going. But if we can, I'd love us to go back to this last crisis that our nation, big crisis that our nation faced, which was August 2011. Folks will remember it as we were approaching the debt ceiling. And Congress, couldn't make a decision about whether or not to raise the debt ceiling. And remember, the debt ceilings just doesn't talk about future spending. It just helps us make good on our past spending decisions. And so we got this thing called the super committee, and then we saw how well that worked, which was not at all. And then we got this thing called sequestration, which is arguably on both sides of the aisle the worst way to consider spending cuts that this nation could have chosen, right? So part of what this budget process, the 14 budget process, didn't do was have a meaningful conversation about the fact that sequestration is an abomination. We should be ashamed of it as a nation. And Congress needed to have found a better, more nuanced way forward. And again, not only was it not able to find a way out of a terrible decision, and Congress made this decision, it can unmake it with some good legislation. It actually just got us into this crisis now that is really doing nothing but costing taxpayers millions of dollars in the chaos fees associated. Signs have to be made. There's confusion. People show up and they, can't access the services. They have to go again. All this kind of malaise is setting in, which ultimately results in, a bad expenditure of money.
And it's troubling because it's sort of becoming normalized, like it's just the new normal, and the consequences of that, the federal budget being one of the cornerstones of our democracy, right? How we spend our money, what our priorities are.
You're so right. You are so right. And the new, here's my hope, if I can tell you my big hope, that seems a little bit outlandish in the face of all this dysfunction, but I think we can do it. The American people can do it. I hope that we turn this into a new opportunity for us to say, look, this is the cornerstone, just as you say, of our democracy. And for example, on National Priorities site, there's a host of information to tell people how it's supposed to work, if we're functioning in a healthy democracy. And I want us to hold lawmakers accountable for this higher standard of behavior, because it is the cornerstone or the intersection of everything we care about. And we can't settle for a new normal of dysfunction. We just can't. You're totally right.
And I think the belief people may have, and if you can, comment on this, is that this is, the result of, limited resources, a poor economy, a down period in our history, not something that is created by politics or people. What would you say to
Yeah,
that?
I would say that's, I think we're in this, I think of it, when I have an image about this, I think of it as a cage right now. We're in this set of beliefs that there's not enough money and that our economy is always going to be dwindling, that the kind of abundance that we had before the economic collapse can't be regained, all of this kind of stuff. And it's just false. All of it is false. We don't have to be locked into this austerity sort of downward spiral that we're in. Another way to look at this is that there is a role for government in our midst. And part of our relationship, yours and mine, through our income taxes and our payroll taxes, is that we invest in a government which then invests in us. And if we were to look honestly and really hardly, if you will, at tax policy, we'd find there's lots of ways to meaningfully, without overburdening Americans and putting us in a bad fiscal position vis-a-vis the business community, there are ways to raise more money. And then similarly, on the flip side, on the expenditure side, there are ways to spend it better. And if we chose to make those decisions, and if the American people actually knew that those decisions were ours to make or ours to influence, then in fact, I have to say that I think we'd be in an unbelievably positive, rich position nationally and internationally.
So there's a letter at the National Priorities Project website to Speaker of the House John Boehner, to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and it was really asking them, to ask themselves, if we wanted to influence last-minute appropriations to avoid the shutdown, how would we have been able to do so? Why that question? And is there an answer? Is there a way that we could have?
No, right now, no. And the letter goes on to say we suspect that answer would be hard to give, right? Because it's such an inside game right now. A very few number of people are actually making the decisions that affect every single woman, man, and child in this nation, all of our lives. And in fact, if we wanted to weigh in right now, the process would have been so convoluted and so misinformed and so locked down and really just a sort of almost a verbal fist fight right now, with some on the most conservative fringes leading the way, that we wouldn't have been able to weigh in. And really, that's a very dangerous position for our nation to be in. So we're asking them to crack it open, to make it more predictable, more clear, more transparent, for them to do a better job at filling their constituents in and seeking input all along the way. And then on the flip side, we ask all of us to not give up on this process, to not think, oh, this is just a bunch of dysfunctional people who can't get along and I'm not going to give up. In fact, we elect them to office. We pay their bills through our salary. You and I and everybody else listening, contribute to 80% of the government's revenue. That's a lot. So we're major stakeholders in this. So it's time for us to roll up our sleeves and say to Congress, we need to get in this. We need to be part of your decision making. You're accountable to us. This is unbelievably bad business all the way along, and let's do it better. And I think this is the opportunity of this crisis.
Now, the National Priorities Project, which is its goal is to democratize the federal budget process. You turned 30 years old now, and you saw the group founded by Greg Speeder, and you sound incredibly energized to fight this fight. Can you tell folks more about this project and your founder and the work you do?
Sure. And thank you for that opportunity. So we actually have a great founding story. I'll tell it really, really quickly. So Greg is our founder and just a visionary man. He actually passed away a couple of years back, but boy, his spirit remains with us. And very, very briefly, in 1983, Greg and three friends were working in a city called Springfield, just very close to where our office is located now. And they were watching, this is post the war on poverty, post-civil rights era, post-women's rights era, they were watching the turnaround in what had been a pretty hard-hit city, post-industrial city. And graduation rates were increasing, poverty levels were dropping, jobs, unemployment was dropping, good jobs were coming into the city, and a lot of it had to do with federal investment. Because again, federal investment has the ability to lift all boats, to actually make the economy stronger. And so long about 1983, things had begun to change. And they went to, at that point, there wasn't the internet like we have it now, so they had to go to the University of Massachusetts, and so they piled into this car and they went to this library, and there were giant, dusty federal budget tomes, as they talk about them. And they cracked them open, and they found that the 1st Congressional District of Massachusetts had lost $54 million over a 2-year period. Now, this is 1983, and that's a lot of money. And so they went to their representative. He was a ranking member in the House Appropriations Committee. He was a man named Silvio Conti. And they said to Congressman Conti, look what's happened. This isn't about one failed program or one ineffective service delivery position or one bad leader of an NGO. This is something really big. This has to do with the federal budget. And Conti said, no way, and shooed him out of the office. But unbeknownst to them at the time, he went around and he sent his aide to the University of Massachusetts to do the same math. And he came back to Conti and he said, these guys are right. These young people were right. This is happening. And Conti had said then publicly that he had never really before considered the local impact of federal spending right there at such a high altitude. He hadn't brought it home to his own backyard. And the story goes that he actually changed his position. He didn't become he was a Reagan Republican at the time, so he really believed in small government. He didn't, there's not a Hollywood ending here, meaning that Conti didn't become a total up-with-people lover of social programs. But he did change. His narrative changed. His relationship to his constituents changed. Some of his votes changed as he really thought about what was happening to the individuals, the human beings in his congressional district. And for Greg and 3 friends, they thought, oh, my goodness, we are powerful. People tell us we're not powerful. We're totally powerful. Good information helps us be stronger. And my heavens, our elected officials need to be held responsible and accountable because maybe they don't fully understand. They're flying at such a high altitude. Let's help them understand what it is that we're experiencing as a result of their decision and help them represent us better. And that was the founding moment of National Priorities Project, and that's been our business ever since.
And that story really makes the point about what is absent today is this movement, this transformation of ideas, this process, this exchange where people shift, and really everybody's so entrenched, there's no movement, there's no transformation of ideas based upon that kind of discussion. It's really, you remind me that is so much the key and so absent right now.
Yeah.
The National Priorities Project website, again?
It's nationalprioritiesies.org.
And is there anything up there right now that you're asking people to look for? Is there any kind of action presently that you have up there? Just a whole lot of information, anything in particular you want people to?
I think the best thing people could do today is pick up the phone and call their senators and representatives. And if their senators and representatives, in their opinion, are fighting the good fight and looking to pass a budget that reflects the priorities of the people in their districts, then say thank you, keep going, take leadership, be strong. And if they're not representing them like they'd like them to be, say simply, we need a budget.
That's a really good question. If you call your representative, senator or representative now, are they going to answer their phone?
Some are answering the phone. Others are having tapes answer it, voicemails. Some have shut down their comment sections.
Is that because of the federal shutdown, or is it?
It's hard to understand exactly on an individual basis. For example, Senator Reid, who's the Senate president, had shut down his comment section yesterday. It's not clear to me why that was. But I do think there are staffers around, and I do think that people will be available. You can also send emails directly to your elected official, and they'll be in his or her inbox. So I think the message is, and I really thank you for this opportunity, the federal budget is ours, yours and mine and all your listeners. And it's a beautiful, it's really our values and numbers. It's a beautiful document. And I know I sound so nerdy and wonky right now, but it's everything we care about in this nation. And federal spending in every sector represents jobs, and that there are so many good people in this nation wanting to have a nuanced conversation about it and figure out the way forward that's nuanced and effective for everybody on both sides of the aisle. And it's time we had that conversation.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking with Jo Comerford. She is the Executive Director at the National Priorities Project, and I'm really glad we could talk this morning, Jo. Thank you for being with us.
I'm so happy to have talked with you. Thanks for your great work, and thanks for everybody in Madison.
Take care. Hey, it's 8